Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, joined this morning by philosopher Peter Singer, professor of bioethics at Princeton University, a former Princeton professor, economist Robin Wells, co-author of the best-selling textbook Principles of Economics. We're trying to recreate the Princeton faculty lounge here this morning. Michelle Goldberg, a senior contributing writer to Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and formerly of the American Conservative, Up veteran Michael Brennan Doherty, who is now the politics editor for BusinessInsider.com. On Tuesday, we've been talking about the big referendum vote in Mississippi. Well, there's another big vote that is slated on Tuesday where folks in Ohio will head to the polls to vote on whether to strip public workers of their collective bargaining rights. At issue is Senate Bill 5, passed by GOP lawmakers and signed by Republican Governor John Kasich back in the spring. In addition to taking away collective bargaining rights, the bill requires firefighters, police, and teachers to pay at least 15% of their health insurance premiums. It also strips them of the right to negotiate over life and death issues like staffing and equipment, although there's been a lot of sort of debate about what exactly the margins of that look like. People will be voting on a referendum called Issue 2, and we all week we've been trying to make sure we ground into our head what the yes vote is and what the no vote is, which is always the problem on these referendums. So if you vote yes, you are endorsing the bill, and if you vote no, a no vote means you want to see it overturned. A yes vote seems you want to see it kept. It made it to the ballot, it's remarkably, after more than 1 million signatures were gathered in the state after the law was passed. A recent Quinnipiac poll shows the law is pretty unpopular. Almost 60% of folks in Ohio are against the law, while only about 30% support it. Whether those numbers translate into overturning the law, we won't know until Tuesday. And I have heard from some folks who are working to overturn the law in Ohio are very nervous that the polling is actually inflated, that it doesn't really reflect, and that it's going to be a far, far closer vote on Tuesday than people realize right now. I've been hearing that from folks in Ohio. Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, who sits on the subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education, has been campaigning against the law, and he joins us now from Ohio. Good morning, Senator.
Good to be with you, Chris. Thanks.
Senator, what's your sense in terms of talking to constituents and taking the temperature of voters in Ohio about where they are on the vote on Tuesday?
Well, the passion's on our side. This fight did need to happen. John Kasich won last year, talking mostly about lost jobs. Understandably, the voters are upset about what's happening. They voted for change. And he spent most of his first year, as have Republicans in the House and Senate in Columbus, going after collective bargaining rights and voting rights and women's rights and dividing the state unnecessarily. And I think that's, in many ways, that's why the polling shows that this is likely going to go down. I'm not convinced yet. I think, as I said, the passion's on our side to repeal this, to vote no. But I think that the kind of money that the Karl Rove machine nationally and the kind of organization that the Republican governor using his I don't know if he's using state resources, but certainly the private resources of the Republican Party and the special interest money makes this a real race. And that's why I'm very concerned between now and Tuesday.
One of the interesting differences between the similar bill that was passed in Wisconsin, obviously, that provoked tremendous backlash as well, and the bill that was passed in Ohio is that the Wisconsin bill very cynically but sort of smartly exempted police and firefighters from the law, whereas in Ohio they are included. And from the reporting that I've read and the people that I've talked to in Ohio about this bill, it seems that the symbolic power of police and firefighters is playing a big part in opposition to the bill. Is that your sense?
Well, I think conservatives and liberals and people everywhere think that one of the most important functions, if not the most important function of our government, is public safety. And the governor attacked public safety forces. He attacked police and fire. And first responders. He attacked teachers and librarians and mental health counselors and state workers. And as someone pointed out, this may be the first time in American history when the issue of collective bargaining rights has actually been on a ballot in a major state for voters to decide on. So this is a big deal nationally because collective bargaining is at stake. And anybody that's at all fair-minded understands the reason we have a middle class in this country. A big part of the reason, underscoring or the undergirding of that, is that workers have been able to organize and bargain collectively when they've so chosen. And that's what created this, particularly post-World War II prosperity, and made us the richest country in the world.
Conservatives, when they articulate their argument against collective bargaining on benefits and workforce rules for public employees, They make the argument that public employees are not like private employees in some crucial ways. And I want to play you just a little bit of sound from 1979. This is from Toledo, Ohio, when there was a firefighters' strike. Take a look.
Fires burned out of control in Toledo overnight as firemen manned picket lines instead of hoses. Firemen joined police, garbage collectors, and other city employees in a 2-day strike, which left Toledo virtually unprotected. Residents were rescued from this burning building by supervisory personnel.
How many more people live in there?
I want you to respond to that because it seems to briefly sort of play devil's advocate on behalf of the conservative argument here that public employees and public safety employees are a different kind of employee than private employees, and maybe the same rules shouldn't apply to them.
Well, I think that clip shows exactly how that was a pre-collective bargaining clip. 1979
right.
Collective bargaining passed in 1983 in Ohio. I think that's the whole story. That you don't see cops calling in with blue flu now.
Right.
You don't see the kind of labor strife that you saw before, because workers have an ability to sit down at the table with employers, not with management, the cities, the counties, the state, the school boards, and not just to discuss wages, but as a teacher told me in suburban Columbus, when I sit at the table with other teachers, we're also bargaining for smaller class size on behalf of our students. Mike Taylor of the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police in Ohio, said we also bargain for our bulletproof vest, our safety vests, firefighter. They're all bargaining for something more than just wages and benefits, and that's what Governor Kasich seems to forget in what the far right in their national agenda to push this anti-labor, take away collective bargaining with prevailing wage and right to work and pensions and all coming up next if they're victorious on Tuesday. That's what makes it important for Ohio, but makes it important nationally on this whole issue.
Senator Brown, I'm going to ask you to stick around. We're going to go to break, and the folks here at the panel would like to ask you some questions. So we'll be right back after this.
Glad to. Thank you.
We've got Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown on satellite here. He is in the state that will be holding a referendum vote on Tuesday to see if the state will uphold a law passed and signed by Republican Governor John Kasich that would severely limit, if not get rid of collective bargaining for public employees in the state. Peter Singer, you had a question for the senator.
Well, I noticed, Senator, you mentioned the role that unions have played in establishing the middle class in the United States. And, of course, really the middle class is under attack in a way now, because we've never been at a time when the top 1% or the top 5% have held so much of the nation's wealth and have been gaining all the time during the last decades, while the majority of Americans have not seen their incomes rise. Do you see this as part of that movement to reinforce the privilege of those right at the top? And is that why you think there's so much resistance in Ohio, that people are starting to realize that there are forces that are trying to polarize society in that way?
Yeah, Peter, I don't see any question that there is some relation between the Occupy Wall Street and what's happening in Ohio. We had 17,000 volunteers circulate, or up to 17,000 volunteers in this campaign. The number of signatures, as Chris pointed out earlier, we over 1 million signatures were gathered. We only needed to gather 250,000 signatures back in the spring. And interestingly, the Secretary of State, when the boxes were brought in full of petitions, the Secretary of State's office had to call in a structural engineer to make sure that the floor could support boxes full of 1.3 million signatures, and that's a true story. And people get it. That's why people realize that that government needs to increase taxes on people making over $1 million a year. I mean, this isn't class warfare. I mean, the class warfare really has been the elite in this country and the privileged and Wall Street and others committing class warfare aimed at the middle class. And this rollback of collective bargaining rights is part of that, as is the push by the Republicans still for more tax cuts for the rich, their resistance to any kind of tax increase on the wealthy, and it's the voters and the public's had it on this. I mean, it's clear the public recognizes that exactly what you said, that basically the last 10 years, 90% of the public's not had a raise. Any raise they get goes into health insurance, if they've got it at all. And the top 1% has seen their incomes double and triple. And what's fair about that? All when people are working just as hard, maybe harder than ever before.
Senator Robin Wells here, economist, wants to ask you a question.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that. And I agree completely with you that there has been a long-term agenda of the Republican Party to diminish collective bargaining, and that has helped drive the great increase in income inequality that we have. Ohio, of course, being a very important state next year. Do you think that people in Ohio are seeing this issue and beyond Kasich? Or are they taking it forward into the election in 2012?
Oh, I think a defeat of a rollback, a repeal, a no on issue 2. If we win on Tuesday, I think we will, but I think it's much harder and closer because of their money and their last minute sort of hysterics, if you will, make it harder than the polls suggest and some pundits say. But I think people do carry that through because people see this very partisan legislature going after, as I said, collective bargaining rights, going after voting rights, weakening voter laws that Republicans pretty much wrote with some Democratic input 10 years ago on early voting and all, and going after women's rights. In Washington, it's going after Medicare, it's going after Pell Grants, things that there was consensus about in this society for decades, by and large, and that's what's troubling. But I think that the income inequality is also a result of tax policy, trade policy, globalization. We passed this year a bill that I introduced on China trade to push the Chinese back on manipulating currency. It was the biggest bipartisan jobs bill the Senate's passed, I think, and there was clear, overwhelming support in the public. The public just wants a fair shake. They're working hard. They're playing by the rules, as the cliche goes, and they deserve a fair shake. And they're not getting it from large corporations. They're not getting it from globalization, and they're not getting it from their government.
Senator, you're up for re-election in 2012, and I wonder how you explain to constituents who feel frustrated with the elevated unemployment, particularly in a state like Ohio, which has had a lot of loss of manufacturing and deindustrialization even before we hit this period of financial crisis. How do you explain to them the fact that Congress seems unable to do anything to help them to pass jobs in terms of the sort of way the filibuster has been institutionalized, the opposition to the Republican Party? Is it hard to communicate to people exactly why things aren't getting done, or do they sort of blame everyone equally?
Well, I think in some sense, they blame everyone equally, but I think what the president's done the last 2 or 3 weeks, instead of this kind of move to the middle, there's the liberals, there's conservative, there's left to the right, move to the middle, that's where everybody is. That's not really where everybody is. Where everybody is they want a government that's on their side. That's why I pushed that China trade bill, that currency bill. That's why I oppose these trade agreements like the trade agreement with Korea. We passed, clearly our trade policy isn't working. We have these huge trade deficits, and the response of the elite in Washington, unfortunately, some members of my party, with almost all the Republicans, saying let's do more of it and pass more trade agreements. I think in the end, it's showing to the voters whose side are you on. Are you willing to take on Wall Street on behalf of Main Street? Are you willing to take on corporations that outsource jobs and then do something that companies I don't believe in history really have done, shut down manufacturing in Mansfield or Youngstown or Toledo, Ohio, and move it to Wuhan or Xi'an or Beijing, China, and then sell the products back to this country. People see that as a betrayal of the middle class and a betrayal of our values and our national interests. And voters, in the end, want somebody that's on their side that'll fight them on that.
Senator, Michael Brendan Doherty here from Business Insider.
Hi, Senator. Obviously you're right that there's an ideological difference between Republicans and Democrats on this issue that's dated back a long time. But it's only become live as tax revenues have crashed in the last few years, and really only politically possible for Republicans to even get this on the agenda. I mean, a lot of these public benefits packages and pensions were based on a model of increasing revenues and growth from the 90s and the early part of this decade, continuing on forever. I mean, it seemed like it was inevitable that if growth leveled off or there was a crash, that you would have middle-class voters looking at public servants as, competitors for the tax dollar. I mean, how do you get out of this without trying to generate economic growth and not just a few extra taxes on a small percentage of the population?
Well, you do that through the bargaining table, which is exactly what's happened. Public workers and public unions understand budgets, and they see what's happened in their local fire department or their local county Children's Service Agency or wherever they're collectively bargaining, and they know that that those budget issues are real. And you've seen in community after community. I mean, I could give you a long list of public employee unions that have done major concessions in order to get, because they want as many of their fellow firefighters and police officers and teachers and librarians and public workers working. So they've done the kinds of, I think, good citizenship and economic reality that they've needed to do by saying, yes, we will do these givebacks to the table. Unfortunately, what the governor in Ohio did and what the legislature did was use that as an excuse, use budget issues as an excuse to take away rights. And that's what's, as I said, that's what's so sad about this. We should be focusing together, Republicans, Democrats, state, local, federal government, on how to create jobs. Instead, they've injected this divisiveness that just didn't need to be there by going after women's rights and worker rights and privatizing Medicare and voter rights and all those things that shouldn't be on the table. We really ought to be focusing on job growth. So, in fact, the issues you mentioned would be less acute if we could grow ourselves in part out of this mess.
Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio, thank you so much for coming on the program. Hope we can have you back, and I'll let you get back to your Sunday morning.
Thank you, Chris.
Take
always.
care.
We'll do it again. Thanks.
Erin Brockovich joins us here in the studio right after this. All right, Erin Brockovich may be the second most famous community organizer in the country. With no formal legal education, she successfully fought for a $333 million settlement against Pacific Gas and Electric Company for leaking the toxic element chromium-6 into the groundwater around Hinckley, California. Brockovich continues to fight against corporate malfeasance, mortgage foreclosure, and other local issues. And as if that weren't enough, Erin Brockovich has just published a novel, her second, together with co-author C.J. Lyons. It's called Hot Water. And if you are thinking to yourself, haven't I heard the name Erin Brockovich before? Yes, you have, from the $250 million grossing international hit Erin Brockovich. Welcome, Erin.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Can I ask you just a totally superficial question at first? I'm really curious what the experience is of having your name become so massive in having a movie named after it, and Julia Roberts playing the role, and the bizarre experience of going from being just you to being this name that, like, I imagine if you sign a check in a restaurant or something, people recognize. Is it bewildering, that experience?
It is. It's a little bit surreal. It's a little bit fun. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword because, not everyone necessarily embraces it. So it's kind of a whole gamut of things. I never really know what to expect, actually.
And it's funny, too, because you have this strange level of fame in which your name is probably more famous than your visage, right? I mean, the name is the thing that people can hold on to, right?
That's right. They know the name, but they don't know who I am visually. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's the strangest things. I'll be in a grocery store line and they'll insist there's no Erin Brockovich, therefore I'm not her. Okay.
It's a fictional character.
Absolutely. And it's weird. So, sometimes I'm in this third-party place. But very strange things happen often. So
you're still doing, aside from the writing you're doing, you're still doing work, traveling a lot around a lot.
Oh, absolutely. That's still my main job.
So what would you describe your job as? What do you do when you travel around the country?
I would see myself as a consumer advocate that is really out fighting for and looking for, where we're having public health issues, public wealth, is being jeopardized, health and welfare is being jeopardized. I've recently, this past year, I get tens upon tens of thousands of emails every month. And this past year I've started...
Sounds daunting.
It is daunting. And I've been plotting because so many people have been coming to me in and around contaminated zones, reporting what appears to be excess disease and illness. And it became so much, I decided to plot it on a map. And that map today has 1,668 sites reporting to me what appears to be, to them, 12 kids on one block with cancer or different types of diseases in the community. And so it's become so alarming. I've actually been in discussion with Google on how we can create a people's reporting registry and begin to plot these sites and locations. Because if we don't even just look at it, we'll never find a solution to what some of our problems are.
Is that part of the issue, is that people don't know that it's possible that they are diagnosed with cancer or they have some illness, and they have no means of knowing whether that is also true of people that are geographically co-located with them.
Correct, and they don't know where to report it to or how to handle it. I mean, I have more things happening now because of all the social network explosions that we're going through and Facebook, because people are being stitched back together through Facebook. I've had more groups come to me who from either high school knew each other, college knew each other, but they've all left. They've gone on and had babies, they've traveled internationally, they've moved, but they've found each other again on Facebook. What they've found, though, their similarities are that they have cancer. And then they come to me, and we're actually able to take that group and place them back to a location and possibly look at, was there a source or a reason why all of them have that disease? So it's been fascinating to watch what Facebook and those social networks have done. Do
you worry about? I was reading about some of the work that you were sort of proposing with Google, and it called to mind the issue of vaccines and autism, right? Mm-hmm. Where people felt like they saw a causal relationship, and there was early science that suggested there may be, and that science has since been retracted, and the published science on it, I think, has been quite definitive that there is no established cause, and that's the peer-reviewed conclusion of scientists. Do you worry about sort of producing a kind of similar situation of unsubstantiated fear about causality in sort of bringing people together when it may just turn out that there's a bunch of people that have cancer for no actual discernible reason?
And that's an excellent point, because sometimes that could be true. It's an anomaly. We don't know. And it's certainly not designed to create any type of fear. But here's the other side of the issue. Oftentimes, we might not know if there really is an association with something or a cluster if we can't identify and know all the people that have it. So what's happening with the map is we're able to start referencing this information and possibly giving it to whoever it needs to go to so we can look at all the numbers. You're never going to have the true science if you don't have all the numbers. And more often than not, CDC is a perfect example where there's an outbreak of a situation. People don't automatically know to contact those agencies to report this problem. So this is what I'm seeing happening out there. They're scrambling around, not knowing where to report it to. So they think, well, Aaron Brockovich could help me. So they're reporting it to me.
That's fascinating.
So what we're trying to do is put it on
I saw a movie once, and I think maybe I should email that woman.
Yeah. No, that would be my alias, Julia Roberts. That's
right. That's right. I wonder if Julia Roberts gets tens of thousands of emails reporting cancer clusters as well.
I don't know, but they're getting reported here. So that's a really very, very valid point, and that's the whole purpose of the map. So if we don't look to what the people are saying to us that's happening to them, and in some way be able to report it effectively, then we're never going to know. And if we don't want to ever know, then we're never going to find any kind of solution. But obviously, when I look at this map, it tells me that there's something going on out there that we need to at least look at.
And there are sites all over the country. I think one of the things that is really remarkable is just how many toxic sites there are around the country. I mean, even Michelle and I both live in Brooklyn, and there's the super fun site of the Gowanus Canal. Which
2 blocks from my apartment.
2 blocks from Michelle's apartment, which I walk over every day. But there are super fun sites, and there are toxic sites all over the place, in places that people don't even recognize. I want to talk a little bit about the politics of regulation and corporate accountability right after this break.
All President Obama has to offer them is more stimulus spending, more debt, higher taxes, and more job-killing regulations.
Job-creating principles of cutting taxes are far better than job-killing principles of big government and regulation.
He'll agree to reverse a job-killing regulation, but only if he knows he's gotten dozens of other doozies in the pipeline right behind it.
And here's the big kicker. Businesses today pay $1.8 trillion in job-killing regulations.
I bet you guys did not know that the actual English word regulation is truncated from job-killing regulation, which is the full and original Old English root, job-killing regulation, which the Republicans use. When you hear this rhetoric about the perils and evils of regulation, what's your reaction to it?
Well, there's a couple of reactions that I have. Listen, I'm out in communities. This is what I've been doing for 21 years, and I'm really the foot soldier out there with everybody else on some of these toxic sites. And it's kind of complicated because regulation shows up, but then they go away, and their hands seem to be tied. not everything is getting done. More often than not, I'm seeing things that aren't getting done. And I had a conversation with one of my coworkers not the other day, but we're really seeing more regulation isn't going to be necessarily the answer when we can't even comply with what's on the books. So by pushing more regulations, I think in some ways is causing more problems.
But this is also part of the problem, right, with austerity politics, in that they kind of, starve the system, make the system ineffective, and then that's used as an argument to kind of why systemic answers are impossible. I think what you're arguing for, right, you're saying it's not that regulations are a problem, it's that lack of enforcement of regulations are a problem.
We're not enforcing what we have.
So isn't what we need like a kind of a beefed up, or is what we need? Is it a beefed up EPA, or what is
you need some regulation, and I'm not proposing taking it all off the table, but if it gets to be too much, then there's just suddenly a standstill, and then we're not even dealing with the issue that's on the table. As a layperson out there in the community with people hearing what's going on with them, there is an absence all the way around. The system all the way around is broken, whether it be agencies aren't there, agencies don't come back in to see what's happened to the public
health and welfare. So what do we need for real enforcement?
Well, what I'm seeing is happening right now with the communities is there's going to have to be some kind of transparency, and this is my opinion, in dealing with all these communities. There's got to be some transparency between a community and a company. There really does. And that is not going on because people out in these communities...
In terms of what are the chemicals that are being used, what is being put in the ground, what are the health effects of those chemicals? I just want to make sure that we're concrete about what is happening here. We're talking about companies that are for whatever reason emitting, right? They're and those chemicals are going out into the groundwater or to the earth or into the air.
And what happens is you have these companies and these communities, hey, listen, they have to coexist together in the same place. And these communities will tell you, I don't want this company to go away because I need a job. Right. This is how I feed my family. This is how I get health insurance. This is how I take care of my children. But I don't want you to poison me at the same time. And so they're waiting for an agency who can come in and initiate a cleanup, but here's the thing. It'll just turn into another litigation. The cleanup doesn't get done. People are still being harmed, and so therefore it's not working.
But absent regulations or litigation, what other way is there to enforce transparency? Because companies aren't going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts.
Well, they're not. Litigation is oftentimes used as a tool to get them to do the right thing. And you do have to have some regulation because otherwise they can get away with things that will continue to harm the consumer. And this is where I'm saying, I've seen it effectively happen with some companies who will come out and almost create an advisory board with the community so they can communicate to each other. That community will pick one or two leaders who are their spokesperson to actually sit at a table with somebody from the company so they can hear what it is the community wants and the company that can explain to the community what it is they can offer.
There also seems like there's this issue of sort of timeline accountability in the famous case that
in the film?
In the film, right? The PG.
Forget the name.
I forget what was the movie called again? In the case of the film Aaron Brockovich, the PG&E case, which was chromium-6 in the water supply, that is still unfolding, right? I mean, the settlement, and the part of I think what's so interesting is the timeline of dealing with these issues is so long. I was reading about the Gowanus Canal because I live near it, and they're projecting a 20-year timeline, I think, for the Superfund clean. I mean, it's way. My kid is going to be in college by the time this is cleaned up. What is the status of the original PG&E settlement that you were a part of? Is that still being worked out? Is the chemical still being removed from the groundwater?
Yes, and we're back out in Hinkley again because this plume of chromium-6 is now broken through. Matter of fact, it's even shifted its direction, and now we've got another 1,000 people and several more homes that have been impacted over the past 10 years and more people affected. And see, look, just in a real quick nutshell, I look at this all the time, and I look at a company like PG&E who paid $333 million on the first case, $335 million on the second. They're going to get sued a third time. They've spent, $50 million? Let's lowball it in defense costs because I don't have those numbers. They're going to spend $75 million in an ongoing cleanup cost. And here's the thing. Had they just, in the first place, either dealt with this community, said there's a poison, which the community would have understood and appreciated that there was some respect on their end, this litigation would have never happened. We would have a better environment out there. We would have healthier people and a company that could have saved $500 million. So somewhere we're not doing business the right way.
And what I think this points to, this is a point that a writer by the name of Tom Gagan, who I really like, makes, is that in the U.S. what we've seen is a tendency to sort of move the regulatory function of government into the area of litigation, right? Because we do not have a very strong enforcement regime, an effective regulatory edifice constructed, what we get is litigation. We get lawsuits. And litigation is a really inefficient way of regulating things. I mean, it ends up costing...
It takes 20 years to go through the court system. So where is it we're making a change?
Erin Brockovich is an activist and author of the new novel Hot Water. It's a pleasure to have you at the table. I hope you come back next time you're in New York.
Thank you.
Take care.
For having me.
What you should know for the news week ahead, that's coming up next. Because we are committed to getting it right here on Up, we do corrections when warranted in a segment we call Update. Last week, during our discussion on voting rights, one of our guests mentioned that an NRA, National Rifle Association card, is an acceptable form of identification when voting in Texas, but a student ID is not. But that is not quite right. According to Rich Parsons at the Texas Board of Elections, you cannot use an NRA card as an acceptable form of ID when voting, but under Texas law, licenses to carry concealed handguns are an acceptable form of identification to vote, and student ID cards are not. So we just wanted to make that important distinction. And if you catch an error during the show, don't feel shy about tweeting us about it at Up with Chris. In just a second, what you should know for the week ahead. But right now, it's time for a preview of Weekends with Alex Witt. Alex, what's coming up this morning?
All right, Chris, we'll get to it right now. A new book by former President Clinton with some indirect advice to President Obama about jumpstarting the economy, among other things. We're going to get a preview of that. It is exactly 1 year from the 2012 presidential election, and a new article examines the mood of America. So we're going to look at how you might be feeling this morning. And a fairly strong earthquake in Oklahoma, of all places, but it did not end with just one quick shakeup. It didn't stop. We're going to explain all that. It's coming up on Weekends with Alex Witt. Chris, we're going to be rocking and rolling with that this morning.
Sounds great. So what should you know as you watch the news unfold this week? Well, you should know that in the last month alone, 650,000 people joined credit unions, as many as in all of 2010. And you should know that even though the official Move Your Money date has passed, there's no reason you can't join a credit union whenever you feel so moved. You should know the way we measure poverty in this country is about to change, almost certainly for the better. This week, the census will unveil new poverty estimates based on a more rigorous and accurate assessment. You should know the good news is likely going to be that the increase in poverty during this recession isn't quite as dramatic as had been reported, thanks to government social safety net policies like food stamps and the Earned Income Tax Credit, which weren't counted by the old measure. But you should also know the bad news is that even with the new revised numbers, tens of millions of people in this country are living in poverty. And you should know that despite what the Payne Caucus says, it doesn't have to be that way. You should know that polling still has one Herman Cain atop the GOP field. And you should know that if the great right-wing noise machine can convince millions of conservatives that evolution and global warming are fictions imposed by a liberal elite, then convincing them that Cain is the victim of a liberal media conspiracy will be a piece of cake. You should know that while the Eurozone crisis festers and creditors call for more pain and more austerity in Greece, the people of Iceland have seized control of their own fate in the wake of their own financial crisis. You should know they've written a new constitution. They've told creditors they're just going to have to wait to be paid back. And despite predictions of misery and Armageddon, you should know that so far, it's working pretty well for them. You should know that Illinois Congressman Joe Walsh, who's currently being sued by his ex-wife for over $100,000 in allegedly unpaid child support, received an award last week from the Right-Wing Family Research Council Action Committee for, you guessed it, unwavering support of the family. You should know that sometimes it seems like the right is more concerned with the capital F family in the abstract than actual families. You should know next time you fly in or out of Washington, D.C.'s Reagan National Airport, you will be greeted by a positively Soviet-style statue of the hero of modern-day conservatism, the Gipper himself, gazing out into the American morning with an irrepressible smile on his face. You should know that surrounding the statue will be plaques bearing the names of each of the 20,849 people who died of AIDS before President Reagan delivered his first speech on the topic. You should know I made that last part up, but I wish I didn't. And finally, you should know that a group of starlings is called a murmuration. And you should know this is the breathtakingly beautiful spectacle of a murmuration in flight. My guests are going to come back and tell us what they think we should know this week, right after this. guests are back to tell us what we should know and you should know as the news unfolds this week. Peter Singer of Princeton University, bioethicist. What should people know this week? What's hot in ethics this week?
What's hot in ethics? Well, obviously the Mississippi Personhood Amendment has made that a hot topic. But, there's a lot of issues still around that don't get talked about. I mentioned climate change in the question I want to ask John Huntsman. I think that's a real moral issue that's just being ignored in the United States at the moment. Foreign aid is another thing. When people are talking about budget cuts, they seem to imagine that foreign aid is a large proportion of the government budget and it's important to cut it. It's actually 1%. And if you do cut it, people are concerned about life. If you do cut it, you are consigning more babies to die, because without providing basic health care, there are already, UNICEF says, 7.6 million children under 5 who die every year from avoidable poverty-related causes. Our foreign aid's not as effective as it could be, but it is still helping to reduce that number. That's a big moral issue that people should think about.
And they also should probably think about the fact that it's fascinating to watch Republicans both kind of demagogue against foreign aid and say that our support of Israel is invaluable, because, of course, Israel is the biggest recipient of American
that 1%.
foreign aid. Yeah.
Right. Robin Wells, what should people know as we head into the week?
I'd like to quickly try and dispel some of the misinformation about increasing taxes. Of course, the Republicans have tried to paint Obama as the big increaser of taxes and how this will destroy the economy. The fact is that among advanced nations, we are greatly undertaxed. Now, of course, you don't want to put taxes on working people, middle-class people who are struggling right now, but there's absolutely no reason why we can't raise taxes on people who are making more than $1 million, who've seen the lion's share of the gains over the past 20 years have gone to the upper 1%, and more so to the upper 0.1%. That's the 1/1000th of the American, whereas people in the lower income ranges, particularly working people and poor people, have actually seen their incomes decline over the past 20 years. That's the first time this has happened in the United States since the Great Depression, all right, this vast income inequality. The other thing I want to say, though, as well, is we need to institute a transactions tax on financial transactions. We need to go along with the Europeans.
It's a pet issue up with Chris Hayes.
Once the Americans sign on, along with the Europeans, it will be done. It's a very tiny tax, but on billions of dollars will have no effect on financial transactions because it's too small for the agents to see. But it can raise vast amounts of money, more money actually than we can raise by taxing millionaires.
And it would also have the benefit of taxing an activity that can be harmful, which is speculation, and algorithmic trading, and people that are doing trades, thousands of trades per second, for instance. It'll make that more costly. But if you're buying and holding in your IRS, then it's going to be essentially negligible, right?
Yeah. And again, this is like the Robin Hood tax, right? You're talking about, and again, it could be used to help, or part of it could be used to help global poverty.
Yes,
right? Make a huge difference.
Michelle Goldberg of the Daily Beast and Newsweek. What should folks know this week?
Well, I think what people should know when they're watching these elections unfold on Tuesday is that although the Mississippi law, it might be easy to be somewhat cavalier about it because it's almost certainly going to be held unconstitutional, at least as it pertains to abortion. This is coming to a lot more states in 2012. You're likely going to see it on the ballots in Ohio, in Montana, in Florida. And this is not just kind of a challenge to, the existing law on abortion, but it's also going to end up having a big effect, I think, on the 2012 election. These laws are really useful in terms of giving churches a way to get really involved in kind of registering voters, in doing get out the vote, in basically becoming auxiliaries to one of the political parties because they're working on an ostensibly nonpartisan issue. Just as gay marriage was hugely important to mobilizing churches for George Bush in 2004. These could be really, really important players in 2012.
And you think we're going to see? You think success on Tuesday augurs that this will be replicated in more states, right, despite the fact that there are the sort of parts of the mainline pro-life movement are.
Yeah, they've already started. I mean, they've already passed, I think, the first hurdle for getting it on the Ohio ballot, and they don't really they kind of know that they're not going to be successful in a lot of these places, but they see it as a movement building exercise, even if it's doomed to failure.
Michael Brendan Doherty, the new politics editor of Business Insider. What should folks know as we head into this week?
Well, they should know. I think people are trying to wrap their heads around this Herman Cain phenomenon.
They sure are. We spent an hour trying to wrap our heads around it yesterday.
And especially since, I thought immediately after the Politico story broke last week that there were 2 settlements of sexual harassment allegations before they went to court. I thought he was over. I thought by the middle of the week his boomlet would end, and it didn't. And it tells us that in sexual harassment scandals, there has to be the face of a woman, there has to be an act alleged, there has to be an exchange of words or a prop or something.
Some detail, some colorful detail.
Some detail, because otherwise people seem disinclined to believe it, and they think that the only victim is Herman Cain in this. And until there are some sort of specific details, it's not a sex scandal. And as I said during the break, Jerry Seinfeld on his sitcom tried to say, well, when does it become sex? Well, when the nipple comes out and makes an appearance. It's the same thing with a sex scandal, is that until there is some salacious detail that people can latch onto, it looks like a media scandal.
I think it's a really good point, because we were talking yesterday about the sort of weird conflicted intuitions that we have about sex scandals, sexual harassment, sex outside marriage, affairs, setting pictures of yourself on social media, etc. And I think that the sort of prurience of it is so much of a driver, and having some sort of iconic detail that we had in the Clarence Thomas case, we had in Bill Clinton, we had certainly with Anthony Weiner, that is absent now, is sort of keeping a lid on it. I want to thank my guests today: philosopher Peter Singer, economist Robin Wells, Michelle Goldberg, who's author of a fantastic book called Means of Reproduction: Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, that I commend to you. Michael Brendan Doherty, who is doing a top job at BusinessInsider.com, and you should check that out. Thank you all. Thank you at home for joining us. We will be back next Saturday at 7 a.m. Eastern Time and Sunday at 8 a.m. You can set your DVR right now. My guests next week include MSNBC's own Martin Bashir and one of the most hated men on Wall Street, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. So set your DVRs now. I mean it. And in the meantime, you can find us on Facebook at Up With Chris. Up next is Alex Witt, and we'll see you next week here on Up.